My name is Margaret Starbird, and I've written a book called The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, Mary Magdalene and the Holy Grail. I came from a very traditional Catholic background and stayed mainstream all of my life. I've raised 5 kids in the Catholic Church, and at some point I guess I started examining some of the truths that I hadn't really thought about before, and have come up with an idea that perhaps it's true that Jesus was married and that his bride, his wife, was lost during the turmoil that followed the crucifixion in Jerusalem. And because of the great danger she was in, his friends would have been at a great pains to save the life of his wife and family. So I investigated this whole theory and tried to make it into a readable book so that other people could examine the same idea. I have no proof that this is true. I only know that the evidence for it is extremely significant. I first heard of the Black Madonna actually when Pope John Paul II was inaugurated as Pope. And because of his devotion to Our Lady of Czestochowa, my friends and I were interested in the image of the Black Madonna. And we ended up dedicating this, or consecrating a small community of lay Catholics to the Black Madonna as Virgin of Virgins, as a symbol of our nothingness, the nothingness of the human family in the hands of God, and making ourselves available to God in our nothingness. And that was the whole idea of our consecration at the time, was that we would be hands and feet for whatever God wanted. And of course, we had no idea where that would lead us at the time, but that was 1978, 79. And then later, of course, there was a big explosion of interest in the Black Madonna after that. But we kind of felt like we were pioneers in this whole movement because we had taken that leap early in 79. And she's been extremely, devoted, I guess, and caring for us through the years. It's been amazing, really, how we've related to that image and where it has brought us into understanding more and more about the other side of God, the feminine side of God. I visited those sites of the Black Madonna, several of them anyway, as a graduate student in Europe in the 60s, mid-60s. But at that point I hadn't really been grabbed, you might say, by this image. I believe that the darkness of this woman comes from, actually from the Song of Songs and from the whole wisdom tradition and the ancient goddess cults. The Isis figures often are black, Artemis also. In the ancient world, some of the goddesses, I guess we all know, were pictured as black in the ancient world. And in the cults of the love goddess, the sacred marriage rituals, the love poetry there is widespread, of course, in the Middle East, but it's found in the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament. And there it clearly says that the bride is black from labor, or she's swarthy, actually sunburned, from laboring in her brother's vineyards. And of course the whole idea of the sacred marriage is the union of the opposites, the sun god and the lunar or earth goddess are being united in this marriage of the opposites. And all the love poetry from this sacred marriage ritual is centered around that theme of the marriage of these opposites. And it's a fertility rite at the same time. So it's a very significant cultural background of this goddess worship in the ancient Middle East. And I believe the bride, because the bride was pictured as black, that is significant for this area where Mary Magdalene later is said to have arrived on the coast of France, because their devotion to a black Madonna would then be to the hidden bride of their tradition. Rather than necessarily the mother of Jesus, it would have been the bride that they were honoring as black. Magdal has the root word mag, which means great in Greek, as in magnificent or any other word you want to find. Okay, Magdalader was a place name for a little hill outside of Jerusalem where shepherds would watch over their flocks, and it's called the Tower of the Flock. That's the Hebrew translation, or stronghold of the flock. Okay, and they were talking about a place name, but there's a prophecy in the book of Micah that says, through you, O Magdalader, the tower of the flock, dominion shall be restored. For now you must go out into the fields, but from there you shall be rescued. And I believe the early community realized that this woman in exile would someday be restored. and that the Magdal in her name may have reflected this reference to that ancient prophecy of their people for the restoration of the house of David to Jerusalem. The question of the blackness of the Madonna is really essential to understanding the symbolism here. If she was really the bride, if this black Madonna really represented the bride in the ancient cult, the love goddess in other words, she would have been representative of even Venus and Attis, that cult, Aphrodite, Inanna and Demuzi. All of these ancient goddesses had their bridegroom, and the bride and the bridegroom then were celebrated in this reenactment of the ritual of the sacred marriage, and then the bridegroom was later sacrificed, and after 3 days he was resurrected. So there are a lot of similarities. You can see similarities in this ancient cult with the actual practice in Christianity that developed. And so it's not like Christianity just showed up one day and said, oh, this is something new. It really was a reenactment of something that was very old in that area. Okay? Now, in the blackness then was the bride as black is indigenous, I guess, to the cult. But then the poetry then, when it calls the bride black, if you were to picture the bride, then that would be how you would picture her. And it would be a symbolic reference to the fact that she was bride. The blackness then would be a symbolic reference to her position as bride. Also in the Old Testament, there are references to the princes of Judah who are black and not recognized in the streets because they have been repudiated by God and their country has been wiped out and they are a conquered people with no dominion and no authority. And so they are said to be, the princes of Israel were once white as snow, now they are black as soot and unrecognized in the streets. That's from Lamentations chapter 4. So you see the whole, and the image of the widow of Zion is another image of this poor woman who's totally destitute and has no children anymore. They're all gone and her people are wiped out and she has no power and no authority anymore. And so all of these images, I think, feed into this whole idea of this black bride who's lost and who needs to be replaced or restored. People will wonder how this woman could ever have been lost if she was so important. Well, my feeling is if you place yourself back in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, you would realize that he was a political execution, right? That people were following this man around in the streets and proclaiming him king. Not only that, but he was charismatic in his own right, healing the sick and declaring the prisoners free and all the things that frightened the authorities, who were not really even just the Jewish people, but the Romans were in charge. They were the occupying forces. Try to picture Roman legions walking around the streets with the swords, strapped to their waist, and that's what you had. This was an occupied territory. And so if Jesus was really being proclaimed king, then the people there who were in charge would have wanted to get rid of him, and anyone of his followers would also have been in danger, and especially his wife and family, because their blood in the Middle East, bloodlines are everything. If you have the bloodline of the king, then that's a dangerous thing to let go. You'd have to do away with it. So my feeling is that this woman would have been in so much danger that they would have taken her away. His friends, Jesus' friends, would have taken her away immediately, as soon as possible, from that scenario and given her a safe place of refuge. She was a political refugee. And then later, I think she probably went to Egypt first, because that would have been the closest place where they had a strong Jewish community where she could have just fitted in without any question. But then I think later they realized that even that was not safe enough and that they would have gone on to France. And of course, that's where all the legends of the Holy Grail stem from, the same area in France. It said Mary Magdalene brought the Holy Grail to France. And then the question is, well, what's a Grail? That's the question. What is the Grail? The legend of the Holy Grail in French, in Old French, says that Mary Magdalene brought the S-A-N-G-R-A-A-L. That's the spelling. S-A-N-G-R-A-A-L. And people look at that and they say, oh, S-A-N, that means holy. So G-R-A-A-L must mean Grail. But when I looked at the word, I saw S-A-N-G-R-A-A-L. And if you break it after the G, then that word means blood royal. So instead of saying that Mary Magdalene brought a Holy Grail to France, it really says that she brought the blood royal to the coast of France. And to bring the blood royal to the coast of France is something different. You know, it's like, well, you don't carry the, I don't know about you, but I don't carry the blood royal around in a vessel with a lid on it. It's carried in an earthen vessel. A human being carries the blood royal. And so that just put a whole new emphasis, or a whole new plane, really, of understanding of this ancient French legend about the Holy Grail. That it's really a person they were looking for. No wonder the King Arthur and his knights couldn't find the artifact they were looking for. They should have been looking for a woman. Then they would have found it. They should have known it was a family. It was a special family that had custodianship of this Grail, and that was pretty important. The whole idea was that it was a mystery, it was hidden, and that it was more sacred than the church that was already in evidence, the Roman Church, that these people really had a whole other way of looking at Christ and at the church, and all their doctrines and everything were different, and significantly different. I think the reason that they arrived in France was probably because it was accessible by ship. All they had to do was get on a boat in Alexandria and go across the water, and that seemed to be an easy thing to do. The Roman Empire, you know, they had communications and trade routes between these great cities in the Roman Empire. So it wasn't that big a switch. It would have been a new language for them, I feel, that they had a lot of readjusting to do after they moved. But I think in order to be safe from all the past and all the persecutions that they knew were going on in Jerusalem, you see, the boat that carried these people was said to have arrived in 42 A.D. And several Marys were on board, not just Mary Magdalene, but Mary, the mother of James. James is the brother of Jesus, so if Mary, the mother of James, could easily be the Virgin Mary, too. And no one's really sure about that. And they don't talk about it because they have other traditions that say she died in Ephesus. But the fact is, if Mary, the mother of James, was really on the bed, that could easily have been the mother, Mary Magdalene, and then her brother and sister, Lazarus and Martha, were on the boat, and then this little Sarah child. And they said, oh, well, yeah, Sarah, the servant girl. They couldn't figure out in the legend why they would have this little girl on board. All right? I looked at that and I said, well, it means princess in Hebrew. So, of course, if she were princess, she would be the daughter of Mary and Jesus. And the age was right, because 42 A.D. would have been about 10 years after Jesus' death, between 9 and 12 years anyway, and that's about how old this little girl was supposed to have been. And I just thought, well, that seems too uncanny a coincidence to be just brushed over the way we've been brushing it over for 2,000 years. Maybe we ought to look again at this young girl on the boat. And I thought the reason they called her dark-skinned was probably, they call her Dark Sarah, or Sarah Kali, the gypsies do, but the idea is that she was born in Egypt. And so Sarah the Egyptian, everyone would just assume she would have dark skin if she was Egyptian, right? But the fact was, that just means that that's where she was born, which was where she would have been born if her mother had left Jerusalem in a panic after the crucifixion and tried to get out of town. She would have been born in Egypt. So that's a simple, you know. And as I said, I have no proof of any of this. I just know that in my heart it just speaks to the whole issue of, you know, why were they black, why were they unknown, why were they hidden, and all these things seem to evolve into that as a possible answer. I suspect that they were delighted to be there, and I expect too that the people would have welcomed them. You know, you have to remember the Gospels had not yet been written, so they weren't even carrying written words. They were just, this was the earliest form of Christianity, was when they talked about what God did for them. It was like chapel homes where everyone honored God in their own house, and then they would share their bread and whatever with their neighbors. And that was just the earliest message of Christianity anyway, and that's what they brought with them from wherever, you know, from Jerusalem or Egypt, wherever they came from. So I would have expected them to find a happy home there. And there was a group of them. It wasn't one person, it was a group of 8 or 9 people together. So I would have expected them to be happy. Sarah is honored by the gypsies as their queen because she's Sarah the Egyptian, and that's where gypsy, the word gypsy came from, the word Egyptian. That's why they call the gypsies gypsies, because at first they thought they were Egyptians. And it turned out a lot of them came from Romania and other places in the Balkans, but the original word for gypsy came from the word Egypt. I think Sarah the Egyptian, they called her gypsy because she was Egyptian, born in Egypt. Sarah means queen, you see, so or princess. So they may have understood that. In fact, I have heard people say, and read also somewhere, that she is noted as like empress or queen in their culture. When they talk about tarot cards, she's the empress or something. I mean, she is really a very strong presence in their version of their religion and their past. She's it. She's important. I think they encountered the image of Sarah in France and then brought their traditions of what they used to do in India or wherever and adopted her as their Western, icon for that reason. But I think there are other reasons for her being there. It had nothing to do with gypsies in the beginning. Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, has no feast day in the saints. Mary Magdalene does, and Martha and Lazarus both do. But the Mary who sat at Jesus' feet, the Mary who was the sister of Lazarus and Martha, is not honored in the Catholic calendar separately. And that's because Pope Gregory in the 6th century declared that Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, was the same as Mary Magdalene. And so he gave them reason to believe from that statement, proclamation or whatever, that these two saints were the same. But I asked myself early on, I said, if there was a wife of Jesus in the Gospels, which of these women would it have been? And I picked Mary of Bethany, and because of her devotion to Jesus, you see. Over Mary Magdalene even, I picked Mary of Bethany. And then I realized that it was Mary of Bethany who anointed Jesus with the contents of her alabaster jar in the Gospel. In the Gospel of John, it says it was Mary of Bethany. It says it was a sister of Lazarus. It says it in 2 places. Often when you ask a priest or somebody, they'll tell you they don't know who it was who anointed Jesus. But it really clearly says that it was this lady. So then I thought, well, why is it always Mary Magdalene in the artworks that's carrying this alabaster jar? And the reason is because it's the same lady. And when I met a woman from France who told me so much about this area and all the saints and stuff, and I said, well, are they the same? And she said, oh, yes, absolutely. Well, everyone knows that. It's like, you don't have to ask again. That's simple. Everyone knows that Mary Magdalene, Mary, the sister of Lazarus, is definitely the same person. But see, the church has been trying to back out of that one ever since, because they don't want us to know this, I guess.
Why?
That's what I can't figure out. I'm hoping, well, when I first gave my book to the very first priest who ever read the manuscript, I gave it to my pastor because he had jurisdiction, you see, over me. And I thought, well, if he doesn't like it and hates it so much, I'll have to think again before I try to find publishers for it. So I gave it to this priest, and he said, this could heal the church. That was his reaction. And that was why I wrote it, because I could see, if looking into the future, that if you could honor the wife of Jesus, first of all, that an easy way to look at it would be that priests would be allowed to marry. It wouldn't be that they'd have to marry, but at least that would be an option, which could do a lot for the church in some ways. Then the other thing, of course, is that it puts family back in the center of a religion that has had a celibate image of God, a male celibate image of God for 2,000 years. That's a long time to have an image that's a little bit lopsided if Jesus was really married. We really should examine that issue. And to be a rabbi in the 1st century in Jerusalem, you had to be married. In Judaism, marriage was extremely important part of their faith. The very first commandment they ever received was God speaking to Adam in the garden saying, be fruitful and multiply. And marriage and family was a very strong and important tenet of Judaism. And they had a strong wisdom tradition that said, if you're not married, who will trust a man who has no wife and family? Who will trust a man who has no home? And they were radically against the celibate life as anything. And they never would have called Jesus rabbi, as they did in Scripture, if he hadn't been married. The fact that there are so many black Madonnas concentrated in a very small area and around the southern part of France indicates that the people there had a very strong feeling about this image. Okay? And then I had to ask myself, why would they care so much more than anyone else in Europe or in the rest of the world about this particular image? And the reason I believe that image was so strong in them was because of the cult of Magdalene during the Dark Ages. One of the things that the Jewish people always did wherever they went was to keep genealogies of whose father was whom and who was what tribe. And so people coming from Israel, if they had migrated as exiles or as political refugees to the coast of France, that's one of the strong traditions they would have brought with them. And I believe they would have kept track of whose family was whose. And eventually that knowledge would have gotten out. And of course in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which is the book that first addresses this issue as far as I'm concerned, the first work I ever read about it, there was a strong feeling there that the Merovingian bloodline was related to the bloodline of Jesus and Mary. And in fact, when I look at the word Merovingian, I could see the word Mary and the word vine are both in there. Now the vine is so important, and I used to get a little upset with the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail because their knowledge of the Old Testament didn't seem strong. But the vine in the Old Testament was the house of Judah, and it says, the men of Judah are God's treasured plant, or cherished plant. Well, that's pretty strong. And if this family called themselves the vine, then that's straight out of the Old Testament. To be the vine would be the bloodline of this tribe of Judah. So I think that this strong emphasis on this image of the Black Madonna in this particular area just confirmed everything I ever thought about this being the lost bride and people honoring her as the lost bride of Jesus all those years. Now, whether those are actual replicas of Jesus, because you see, the Virgin Mary would also have been black, but for the same reasons, because she was also of the line of princess, and her son was also of the line of Judah. So for the same reasons, they could be also representing her. But you see, I don't look at these two as rival goddesses the way you would in the Greek pantheon when you had Hera fighting it out with Aphrodite and everybody trying to get Zeus's attention or favor or whatever. To me, these two women were flesh and blood, and they were devoted to one another as mother and daughter-in-law, and both devoted to Jesus. So they wouldn't have been at odds trying to fight and be, you know, each one trying to get their moment in the light or whatever. They would have been happy to have each other be honored. You know, that would have been the easy way to understand that. We're dealing with flesh and blood people. You know, God or goddess is important on a different plane, but I'm talking about people who actually walked in the streets in sandals and, you know, carried babies and loved each other. You know, human people. And I think that's an important thing to remember about Jesus, that he wasn't just God, he was a human being, fully human. And this would give you another plane of understanding his humanness as to having been married with a child. And it makes you wonder, too, about the poor priests these days, you know, where they're coming from. How can they help us with the kinds of problems we have if they don't have any experience of what it's like? You know, they've never had to take a child to an emergency room or anything. So, the rose, of course, is an ancient symbol for the love goddess. In all cultures, everywhere, that seems to be, because of the fragrance of the rose, and I guess because it has thorns even, but it's always been a symbol of the goddess. The fleur-de-lis, that's a symbol that's now tied with the French national, it's a national emblem of the French kings. But the earliest kings to claim it were the Merovingians. And before that, you can almost see the way that, it's like an iris plant, okay? The iris flower, where the, it's phallic. I don't know how else to explain it, but the way, and especially it's an image of circumcision, where the skin is peeled backward away from the shaft. So that is clearly a male symbol. In fact, I almost laughed when I realized that the same symbol is used for the Boy Scouts because of its nature. You know, it's just obvious that that's what that is. So, but it was Jewish. I think it was a symbol of the Jewish covenant with God was circumcision itself. And so this emblem being an emblem of circumcision, you can see then if the Merovingian kings borrowed it, that it was their symbol as well for the same reason. The other totem that's important to the Merovingians was the bee. And of course that is interesting because it's matriarchal. A beehive is all based on the queen. And they can't have a hive unless they have a queen. So that, to me, was extremely significant when I realized the Merovingians honored a bee as their sacred symbol of their family. That they found hundreds of them, evidently, in one of the tombs of a Merovingian king when they uncovered his tomb in the late 17th century. All these bees. And so that's, I thought, significant, too. And then, of course, the budding staff would be, I guess some people may already have heard the legend of Joseph of Arimathea bringing the staff to Glastonbury and it budded forth. Okay, again, that's a masculine symbol for this bloodline and the vine that stems from this royal bloodline of Judah. So, and the Grail, of course, is a feminine symbol par excellence. The vessel is the feminine. Okay, and in fact, I'm sure maybe people have all read the book of Rianne Eisler's called The Chalice and the Blade. Okay, so here's the chalice would be this shape, this cup, and the blade then would be the opposite, which is the masculine. And when you put them together, you have the Star of David, which is, again, the most beautiful possible symbol for balance and wholeness. It's the symbol of the sacred marriage of the opposites, the masculine blade and the feminine vessel. I believe that the image of the hand is a very feminine image from ancient times, even Neolithic times. The hand has been, because of the feminine's ability to touch and to have relationship through touch, you know, and feeling. So I'm not surprised to see the hand is almost like a signature of the feminine, you might say. And in fact, it is a signature in India when those little wives of the kings were sent to the pyre with their dead husband. Remember the little wives of all these, not just kings, I think anybody who died had to have his wife follow him to their funeral pyre, and they would put their palm print on a pillar on the way to their burning as a signature. And I guess a movie I saw where somebody did that was so poignant that this little girl, she must have been more than like 18 years old. I bet her husband was old and he had died, and she was going to his pyre when she put her signature with her hand. And I really think now in the medieval watermarks that I found, that was interesting. I hadn't realized that I knew about the Grail until I was groping. How do I know? Why does this all ring a bell with me? And I realized that I had read this whole book of symbolism that had the watermarks out of the Bibles. And what you do is you lift up a page of one of these old Bibles, and you can see this embossed emblem in the page of the Bible. And there were so many emblems that kept recurring over and over. Unicorns. There were over 1,100 unicorns collected by these people who collected the watermarks. And palms. And of course the palm to these people meant maintain the faith. Hold on to the faith. Okay? It's also a greeting, and it also had to do with the word phoenix, which was the symbol for resurrection. But phoenix is also the palm, all right, in Greek. So the palm tree is sort of like an evergreen tree that represents Israel. So this symbol like this had about 5 different meanings, all tied up in one symbol. You see, and so when they adopted this symbol, it was for the royal family of Judah, for the phoenix, for resurrection, for maintaining the true faith. All these things tied up in one symbol, the palm. That's interesting. Then they had lions of Judah, and some of them had the fleur-de-lis coming on their tail. Actually, through the tuft of their tail was this big fleur-de-lis for the Merovingians. And I thought, now why does the lion of Judah have a Merovingian fleur-de-lis on his tail? And I finally realized that, you know, that's not an accident. There's really a meaning to that, you know, that this lion of Judah was really tied up with the Merovingian bloodline. In the Middle Ages, when the heretics were being persecuted by the Inquisition, they had secret symbols that they put in their paintings to keep people aware that they knew the truth. But it was like knowing the Morse code and tapping it out on prison walls someplace in captivity. You know, the idea was to keep those tenets of faith available to people, even though the persecutions were raging all around them. They couldn't talk about it, but they could at least leave their little signature in funny places in their paintings. So I finally zeroed in on the different symbols that they might have used, and one of them that was so obvious was the red X. Okay? And because if you take the word for enlightenment or light in Latin, the word is Lux. But if you use the Greek letters for it, you have lambda, and then they have the U for epsilon, and then you have X for chi, right? So you really have the L, the U, and the X all summed up in one glyph. the X, you see. And so all they had to do was put a little red X somewhere in their painting, and everybody knew, oh, right, that's the esoteric, that's the other church. This man is not as orthodox as he might appear. And of course the painters were happy to accept money for their paintings for these churches, and then they would put their heretical symbols in there, sort of just as a reminder that they were not really Roman Catholic or Roman Church. They were really part of the other church, the other understanding of Jesus as fully man and married. The Church of Amor, exactly. And that's Roma spelled backwards, right? R-O-M-A for Rome and A-M-O-R for the Church of Love. And that's what, of course, and it's always the difference between the power and the love. You know, there's always that struggle going on. Now, some of the Madonnas are just beautiful, but other things are kind of funny. Like you see, there was one painting where the Madonna, where the Magdalene woman was actually holding her breasts in the Astarte pose. I was horrified when I saw this thing. I thought, how could they have looked at this and not known there was something strange about this painting? But you see, those are the kinds of things in medieval art. Nothing is without meaning, and they meant that just as they knew that in life nothing is without meaning, and that all the things you do come home to roost, kind of in a networking. It's like the synchronicity things that happen are all part of this underground interweaving of things. And so they knew that for painting as well. And so everything in their paintings has meaning. When I stumble over Magdalene's, almost always she's in red. Occasionally green for nature and green sleeves and stuff. But a lot of times it's red. And red and white especially. But those were in alchemists, among alchemists, red and white were the opposites because they were passion and purity. In fact, there's a picture of the Madonna that was done by Fra Angelico where she's holding a red and a white rose on the same stem. And that is definitely an alchemical symbol for passion and purity as one. In other words, you didn't have to be virginal and chaste and well, I don't even want to say that. You could be chaste and still be passionate. That was the idea. And that's true womanhood. That's not putting someone off in a box by herself and saying, okay, now she's sealed up and nobody can get to her, like wearing a chastity belt. That's not what it is. It's chasteness and passion in the same person. And Mary Magdalene, for them, represented that person. The triple goddess was depicted with three colors, white, red, and either black or dark blue. And pictures, early icons of Mary had those colors, and so do, well, even in our fairy tales we find Snow White, where her mother wished for a child with dark hair and white skin and lips as red as her blood or whatever. So this is ancient feminine lore that the triple goddess is red, white. I think it's interesting that our flags, the French flag, the British, and the American flag, are all red, white, and dark blue, because that dedicates us to the goddess as well, which I think is something maybe not everyone realizes. The icon was in a monastery at Jasna Gora, up on top of a hillside somewhere in Poland. And this lady had been the icon of the people of Poland and had brought them through all kinds, they prayed to her and she brought them through all kinds of devastating wars. In 30 Years' War, she turned back the armies of Gustavus Adolphus. And in general, she was the patron saint or patroness of Poland. And they've all honored her for centuries. What happened was that at some point, evidently, robbers had gone up to the monastery and had tried to steal this painting. And they had slashed the Madonna's cheek with a sword or something and made it this woundedness. Now that's the legend. Whether that's exactly what happened or whether it was painted on there, I'm not sure. But that was the legend, that the wound. Now what appalled me was I found a 14th century painting by Simone Martini, 13th century even, Simone Martini painting of the Magdalene. It's called The Way to Calvary. And Jesus is carrying the cross, and framed in the cross in the background is Mary Magdalene. And you can tell it's the great Mary because she's bigger than Jesus, even though she's in the background. She is huge. And she has scars on her cheek, too. And there's a scripture right near the scripture of Micah chapter 4, verse 8, where it talks about, to you, O Magdalene, dominion will be restored. That scripture is followed by a piece of scripture, a couple verses that say, with a rod they strike the face of the ruler of Israel. Okay? And we always think of the ruler of Israel being Jehovah, right? Or Jehovah, or whatever, Yahweh. But maybe they understood this in another way when they painted this woman with her scars on her face, maybe that's the side of God that's wounded. The feminine side of God is the wounded side. The immanent side, that's the part of God that plays in a sandbox and cries big tears when they get shoved and pushed aside, and all the little ones of God are represented by this woman who's abused. The Black Madonna Chartres is much older even than Christianity, and they had a prophecy already, the Druids did, of a virgin who would bear a son. A virgin, not necessarily meaning that she didn't have a husband or didn't have a man in her life, but just that she would bring forth this child. And whether they knew that she was, I don't know whether the Christian people, I knew they were surprised when they first discovered this replica, and they built their Christian churches on top of this crypt or grotto by the spring of the strong, the well of the strong, in the basement or in the crypt of Chartres Cathedral. And they had an early wooden building, or they must have had centuries of early buildings, but then the one burned down in the 12th century and then was replaced by the Chartres Cathedral that we have now. But then the revolutionaries destroyed the actual image of the Black Madonna in the crypt. But they had other copies in stone, so they have a general idea of what she looked like. And it was really almost like the Isis figure, as the goddess as throne for the son, the image of the child on her lap. And she's the throne and mother and the establishment of this young king on her lap. But then the other Madonna there is the Madonna of the Pillar. And she surprises me because in my research, I kept coming across this broken pillar idea. And so a black goddess of the pillar I would think would be more likely to be Mary Magdalene, because this whole idea of the broken left pillar of the temple and the idea of the two temple pillars being named Boaz and Yakin, which means established in strength. The temple of Jerusalem was established in strength, and these two pillars bore the name then of established Yakin, and in strength was Boaz. But that has to do with the whole Davidic bloodline. I try to explain that in my book too. I'm not prepared to say that she was, but the action of the anointing is definitely one that a temple prostitute would have performed in the line of duty during this cult of the sacred marriage. So the action of the anointing links her up with that whole tradition and the sacred marriage rite. Now, my feeling would have been probably that she was an heiress to the lands surrounding Jerusalem, and that it was her right then to anoint the king as the heiress of the land. In other words, a dynastic ritual of marriage rather than the cult one. But I'm not sure, and I wouldn't, I would say either one of those would give it validity, and in either case she would have had to have been the bride, right? So it didn't matter to me whether she temple prostitute. I think people looking at what she did said, oh yes, that's the action of a prostitute in the temple, and therefore they called her prostitute based on that action. But I'm not sure that that's really what she was. I think it's more likely that she was dynastic. You got to remember, I was this nice Catholic girl with 5 kids. And I went into a bookstore at Christmas time, and there was on one of these tables was a display of books about different things on sale, and one of them had all these Grail symbols. And I said, now why in the world does this book have all these Grail symbols on it? I knew nothing whatever about tarot, but I knew a lot about the Albigensian heresy, you see. So I picked up the book and I looked at this and opened it up, and what they had done was to put the Charles VI deck in pen and ink drawings across the front of the very front of the book. And I looked down, the very first one that hit me in the face was Peter the Hermit. And I looked there and I said, now why is Peter the Hermit in this book? Peter the Hermit was the man who went around in the Middle Ages preaching the crusade. And what the hidden agenda was to take someone from the bloodline, the Merovingian bloodline, and put them on the throne of Jerusalem so that they would have a legitimate head of state in opposition to Rome, around which they could crystallize their true religion of Jesus that they wanted to teach, you see. So when I looked at this thing, I knew that was Peter the Hermit. I said, what is he doing here? And then I started thumbing through the pages, and then they said, nobody knows where these cards came from, and nobody knows what they are, and they can't tell us anything. They think they might stem back to Egypt, but they can only find them in Provence. And I thought, yeah, and I know why. It was really funny. And I was scared at the same time, because I thought, gee, I don't want to be the only one on earth that knows this. I'd rather that spread the information around a little bit. But the idea was that definitely these were, and then as I looked at each one in sequence, you see, when I saw them in the actual order that they came, it was like puzzle pieces all falling into place. And I thought, this is ridiculous that they did not know what it was that they were hiding in here. Well, it turns out the church probably did know, and that's why they tried to eradicate it. And that's why in the certain early decks, some of these cards are totally missing. Like in this deck that I was looking at, they didn't have an Empress card or the Popess, Papess or whatever, the female Pope. They were missing those two cards. And also, I guess the early one, the Fool and the Adept, or the Magician. But when I put it all together with the symbolism in there, that's so obvious to me, because of knowing what the symbols were in the watermarks, you see, which all came from the same area. It was like I was given all these different pieces and said, okay, now shuffle the cards and put them together, and you'll see what happens. And I looked, and there was all this evidence. Couldn't believe it. But yeah, and other people have said the same thing about the tarot cards, that they were really surprised to see that I had made sense of them and given them some kind of background that they could believe that, yeah, this is where they came from. So anyway, but I was surprised myself. I didn't know I knew that. It was one of those wacko things that just happened. The whole thing about the Magdalene in Western Europe is that she represents the hidden tradition in many ways. But see, that's goddess activity anyway, because we have this transcendence of God where we honor this God with a ritual, and that's a power thing. But then underneath you have the goddess activity of all the networking, all the synchronicity, all the interrelationships of everything. You see, and that's how you get your real knowledge, is from that activity, not the stuff you memorize at church, but the stuff that comes from the heart. The fire triangle is the masculine triangle. This goes back to the chalice and the blade. The fire triangle is the masculine symbol. The blade is the same symbol. And the water is the opposite. Okay? And the water, and of course the water carrier and all this stuff we're having now with water is really the emergence of the feminine. Bring water to the desert. That's my theme song, really. Well, years ago I was on a silent retreat, and that was the theme song was that the theme of that whole retreat was the desert shall bloom. And it was the middle of winter. It was like all the trees had already lost everything. It was icy outside. Everything was covered with ice. And the theme was that the desert would bloom. And so I have counted on that ever since. And when I was in Phoenix in 1990, spring of 93? Yes. I got off the plane, and we got on a taxi, my daughter and I, and they took us to the hotel we were supposed to stay in, and the taxi driver started talking about the rain that they had had, and it had rained in Phoenix all spring, and they had this most gorgeous blooming of everything all over the desert. And I thought, oh, that's wonderful. My book was typeset in Phoenix that spring, right then, when there was pouring rain, and I thought, oh my gosh, everywhere this book goes, it brings the rain. Well, but that's the feminine, see, because as a male, the masculine burns it out. You end up with Holocaust. If you honor the fire triangle long enough, you will have Hiroshima every day of the week. Right? That's what you end up doing. Because that's the model. Right? It's the power model. And water is, and actually the water model is not good either. You have flood, right? So what you really need is the wholeness of them. That's fire and water insurance. You know, one helps the other stay in balance. That's the whole idea. Temperance. Well, the Greeks had it right, and we need to know that. You know, the sound mind and the sound body, and you know, they weren't perfect either, but they had some idea anyway, better than we, of keeping that balance. But culturally, you see, one of the hardest things to realize is that as in heaven, so on earth. Okay, so whatever your model is in heaven, you're going to have on earth. And part of the reason our society is a wasteland now, and we have all these legends of the wounded king, and the Grail, when it's restored, will heal the wasteland. Okay, why is it a wasteland? Because the king is wounded. Why is he wounded? Because he has no wife. All right, he can't relate to a woman because he's been left alone. And so now, in order to get her back, then you have a partnership model again. Okay, you have a male and a female together in harmony. That should be your model for your society. And instead we have this celibate model of God that doesn't include family and wife. So that has, I believe, has warped our society. No matter what they say about loving the family, as long as our model for holiness is male and celibate, then that discounts the whole feminine side of God altogether. And half of his creation is feminine. Part of why they were upset was because they thought she was a prostitute. If you could persuade them that she was his bride, and that was someone that he dearly loved, which is what I do. In my book, I start with a fictional piece that has them loving each other and having him try to warn her of what she's going to have to suffer because she's his wife. And then he has to leave and go get crucified, and she's alone, right? But the strength of their love is stronger than death. And that's, the whole theme is from the Song of Songs, where love is stronger than death. Okay? So what I've done is to put this woman whom everybody was afraid to accept as bride in the context of the Song of Solomon, and Jesus as bridegroom, and that whole thing. And I think even Catholics are thrilled with it. In fact, one Catholic called my publisher and said she'd ordered 25 copies for every relative she ever had for Christmas because she couldn't bear for him not to know. And I thought, well, that's, you know, they can accept it. My own father didn't like it at first, but now he loves it. So, you see, and I thought, well, if he can accept it, even the Pope could love it, you know. And especially since the Pope has this thing about the Black Madonna anyway, if he only knew all the symbolism and stuff that went into that. The very first check I got for a company that wanted to translate my book into a foreign language was Polish. I thought that was really sweet. You don't have to publish that either, but I thought it was really sweet to get this little check from this company that's going to translate it into Polish. I was thrilled. I had tears in my eyes because, I mean, that's my goal. My goal was to heal the church. And when, you see, I didn't do this without praying, and I thought I understood that God needed a vessel to get this out, but once it was out, that he would handle the rest, and that it would not bring misery, but would bring healing, which is what I wanted. So hopefully that'll happen. You guys will be a big help if you can get it out where, you know, where people see how beautiful the image is and how much we missed her. See, my dream scenario is that all the churches in Christendom will ring out joyful bells on her feast day and welcome her home. Thank God she's back. Because really, that's what we've been missing. It's this other side of God where it could be honored and given its due. One of the things I feel that happened was that although Jesus was Jewish, the Christologies that developed around the divinity of Jesus over the next 3 centuries were really Hellenistic, Greek, pagan ideas. Okay? And the Jewish people themselves had to say no to it because they had walked with Jesus in their own streets and they knew him to be fully human. And when I prayed through the Gospels, I realized that Jesus was the last person on earth who would have wanted to be worshipped. The very last person on earth. Every time they tried to make him king, he ran away and hid on a mountaintop somewhere and prayed that they would go away. All right? So that's the kind of person we have in the Gospels. And yet, instead, they crowned him with 16 crowns and chariots and all this other power stuff that really had nothing to do with the Jesus in the Gospels. The God I know doesn't want to be worshipped. He wants to be loved. And that's all the difference. Any more than a bride and bridegroom. I mean, neither one of them wants to be worshipped. They want to mutually serve each other. Their joy is not in receiving, but in giving. Right? And God's that way too. And that's the bridal image of God that we've neglected with this other power, you know, God of power and might who's going to send you to hell if you're bad and all that stuff. It's a bunch of, it's not really God. It's something else. It's a power play trying to keep everybody under control, but it's not God. I think the Black Madonna is an image of God. And it's an image of God that, you know, you think of God as this transcendent and powerful figure who can have anything he wants. But there's also a side of God that can't have anything because he doesn't have hands and feet unless we're willing to be. I mean, how's God going to wipe away a tear? Well, the only way he can do it is if he sends somebody else to do it, one of us, right? So there is that side of God that's very vulnerable and very, and even neglected. I mean, we walk on Mother Earth all day long. We just tread on her. And she never balks or says no. But yet that's an image of God that we fail to realize is part of God. And so I think this black image for all peoples, you know, whether they're Catholic or Christian or not, it's still a powerful image of the way God really is, you know, willing to be walked on, stepped on, kicked around, you know, as long as he's acknowledged at some point and loved. That's all he wants, is to be loved, he or she. God in its totality. At some point in my walk, I realized that 2,000 years of tradition did not necessarily mean that something was true. And if you want to think of it, look at Galileo, you know, they had him under house arrest for saying that the earth traveled around the sun. So, I mean, there are things out there that could be true that have not been taught. The definition of heresy is that something is not the orthodox teaching, but it does not mean that it's not true. And the more I prayed about these issues, the more I figured that, you know, that these things could easily be true, and perhaps the church didn't even know about them, or if they did, maybe they had decided for some reason not to teach them, but that did not mean they were not true. And what really got to me was, what good is a religion that isn't true? I mean, if this faith is not true, then it's not going to fulfill its promises to the people. And instead the people become warped and dried up and destroyed by it. So it'd be better to try to get to the bottom of some of these questions and find out what the truth really is than say, well, in deference to the tradition of 2,000 years, I'm not going to examine it. See, that was something I couldn't do. I had to go examine it, do my own quest. The fundamental message here is that there is a wasteland. Our culture is a wasteland. Our planet is a wasteland. And that in order to be healed, we have to restore the feminine to its rightful place of honor. And in the image of the Black Madonna is very much tied into this image of earth, mother, and bride. And all of these images have to do with restoring the feminine to a place of honor in our lives and in our whole culture. So I think that's the important thing to remember about the image of the Black Madonna. Catholicism is something you can't just shovel overboard either. You know, if once you're raised by families who believe those things, there's no way you're going to just get rid of it. You might as well just, you know, do what you can with it and help to heal it. You see, that's what we were called to do.